Nestled in the heart of a quiet American suburb stands Parkside Oasis, a seemingly idyllic neighborhood with tree-lined streets and spacious condos. The community prides itself on its well-manicured lawns, clean sidewalks, and the meticulous order enforced by its powerful homeowners association, known simply as the Parkside Oasis HOA. While many residents appreciate the structure, some argue that certain officials overstep. Enter Deborah Farnell, a mid-50s board member of the HOA, who is privately nicknamed Karen by neighbors. Though she's not the HOA president, Deborah wields outsized influence through her endless scrutiny of every perceived violation. She patrols the neighborhood with unwavering vigilance, stopping people over trivial matters and penning strongly worded citations for unapproved yard decor or excessive length grass. Her posture is ramrod straight, her gaze piercing, and her voice clipped. In short, Deborah Farnell is known for turning small differences into large conflicts. When an elderly resident named Margaret Rowley starts using a simple footpath behind her building for daily exercise, Deborah decides it's an unsanctioned track that must be stopped. In a reckless move, she spreads coarse gravel along the path, creating hazards for Margaret's walker wheels and inadvertently endangering a vulnerable senior. This cruel act triggers outrage among the community, spurring them to rally around Margaret and pave a safer, more beautiful morning mile walking loop. Deborah's attempt to eliminate what she calls an eyesore walkway instead yields a permanent neighborhood feature that fosters connection, well-being, and mutual support, no thanks to her destructive meddling. What follows is the full account of how an unassuming path for a senior's gentle exercise became a flashpoint in Parkside Oasis, revealing both the worst and best within suburban neighborly life. The sun rose over Parkside Oasis with a soft glow, illuminating neatly trimmed hedges and rows of condos in pale pastel colors. It was early June, when the crisp morning air still carried the scent of dew. In a second-floor unit, Margaret Rowley, an 82-year-old widow, finished her breakfast. She was a petite figure with thinning silver hair, moving at a measured pace with the aid of a walker. Each day, Margaret performed a gentle exercise routine, which included slow laps around the small courtyard behind her building. This courtyard loop was not an official park trail. Rather, it was an informal track formed by years of foot traffic, weaving between a line of cypress trees and a shared grassy lawn. It circled around two buildings in the complex, returning to the same spot. Residents often used it to walk their dogs or jog a short distance, though most stuck to the sidewalks out front. Margaret discovered it when her doctor prescribed regular walks for heart health, suggesting she start on smooth ground in a calm area. With the walker's help, Margaret ventured outside, savoring the promise of a new day. A gentle breeze brushed past her, carrying the chirps of songbirds perched among the cypresses. The path, slightly worn but mostly level, was a perfect compromise between fresh air and safety. She followed the loop at her own pace, pausing at intervals to catch her breath or admire a blooming azalea bush. Younger neighbors occasionally greeted her, and a few older residents exchanged friendly waves. Though Margaret missed her late husband, she cherished these quiet strolls as a source of peace and mild exercise. With each careful step, she felt gratitude. Parkside Oasis truly seemed like a lovely, supportive place to spend her golden years. Little did Margaret know that her modest daily loop was a ticking time bomb, poised to detonate as soon as it caught the disapproving eye of Deborah Karen Farnell. Margaret believed she wasn't bothering anyone. She would soon learn that in a strict HOA environment, even a harmless routine could provoke unwarranted aggression. While Margaret continued her peaceful walk, another early riser had already embarked on her morning ritual, though hers involved scanning the neighborhood for violations. Deborah Farnell, clad in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks, strode through the complex with an almost military air. She clutched a leather-bound notebook containing HOA bylaws, as well as her phone ready to snap photos of any suspicious or unauthorized changes to the common property. Deborah had lived in Parkside Oasis for 6 years. Initially, she was welcomed for her organizational prowess. She joined committees, offered to manage budgets, and made sure newsletters were distributed on time. However, her approach soon evolved into a near-obsessive policing of all that lay within the HOA's purview. Potted plants of the wrong color? Citation. A child's chalk drawings lingering on the sidewalk. Warning letter. Over time, residents learned to keep their heads down when Deborah came by, hoping to avoid her ever-watchful glare. That morning, she walked the perimeter of the courtyard, checking for unapproved garden ornaments or newly planted bushes in violation of the mandated color palette. Rounding a line of cypress trees, she froze. Just ahead, she saw Margaret Rowley, slowly pushing her walker along a narrow strip of beaten-down grass. Deborah's brow furrowed. That area is not an official walkway, she thought. What if it encourages foot traffic that damages the lawn, or sets a precedent for others to create their own paths? She marched closer, heart pounding with a strange mix of excitement and indignation. Margaret noticed Deborah's approach. She paused politely, nodding in greeting. "Morning," she said softly, gripping her walker handle. Deborah's eyes flicked to the wheels pressed into the ground, leaving faint tracks in the dirt. "Mrs. Rowley, is it? I've seen you around. Pleased to meet you." Her tone was neutral but laced with a certain tension. Margaret smiled kindly. "Yes, I'm Margaret Rowley. I live in Building 5, second floor. And you?" "Oh, I'm Deborah Farnell, part of the HOA board," Deborah replied, posture stiffening with importance. "I didn't realize people were strolling back here. Are you aware this area is not an officially approved recreational path?" Margaret blinked, startled by the question. "Well, it's just a patch of grass around the courtyard, dear. I've seen a few folks out with their dogs." "Yes, but we strongly prefer residents stick to the sidewalk for uniformity and landscaping preservation," Deborah insisted. "Any repeated foot traffic can cause erosion or unsightly wear." Margaret's smile wavered. "My doctor recommended a daily walk. I find this loop quieter and less uneven than the front sidewalk. I try to be careful." Deborah forced a thin smile. "I see. Well, I'll have to bring it up with the committee. We can't have residents forging new paths without prior approval." With that ominous note, Deborah turned and strode away, leaving Margaret unsettled. She resumed her slow walk, shaken by the idea that her gentle morning stroll might be cause for controversy. In her life experience, a simple path for fresh air shouldn't ruffle feathers. However, she'd soon discover that in Parkside Oasis, the power of a single HOA board member, especially one as zealous as Deborah Farnell, was enough to spark trouble for anyone. Later that afternoon, Deborah Farnell attended a routine HOA board meeting, held in the community's modest clubhouse. The large conference table was surrounded by the 4 other board members: William Groves, HOA president, Maria Hensley, secretary, Terry O'Connell, treasurer, and Angela Reed, an at-large representative. The monthly agenda typically covered budget allocations, maintenance schedules, and special event planning. Seated with her laptop open and notes carefully arranged, Deborah waited impatiently for her chance to speak. As the meeting concluded routine items, William asked if anyone had additional business. Deborah promptly raised her hand. Regarding the courtyard area behind buildings 4 and 5, she began, leaning forward. "I've noticed an elderly resident using an unapproved route, essentially a makeshift track, through the lawn. This repeated foot traffic could damage the landscaping, create drainage problems, or, worst case, set a precedent for others to do the same." Maria Hensley glanced up, confusion etched on her face. "A single resident walking is that big a concern?" Deborah pressed on. "The bylaws clearly state that common grounds must remain in compliance with the approved landscaping plan. That plan does not include a footpath. If it's permitted to continue, we'll soon see dog owners wearing down the grass, maybe even joggers. The area could turn into a muddy eyesore." Angela Reed sighed. "I've walked back there before. It's basically a small loop around the grass. It's not exactly a major thoroughfare." Terry O'Connell, fiddling with a pin, asked, "And who is the resident?" "Margaret Rowley. She's in her 80s, I believe," Deborah replied. "I spoke to her briefly. She says she uses the area because it's quiet and smooth enough for her walker." Deborah's lips thinned. "But we must maintain uniformity. If she needs exercise, we have sidewalks out front." The board spent good money keeping them in pristine condition. The room fell silent. William Groves tapped his pen thoughtfully. He was a measured man, not prone to hasty decisions. "Well, Deborah, I'm not convinced this is an immediate crisis. I don't see a direct violation that demands harsh measures. But if you think we should address it, perhaps we can gently remind residents that the designated walking areas are the sidewalks and the clubhouse track." We do want to protect our lawns. Deborah's eyes flashed with frustration. She wanted a stronger response, maybe official signage or warnings. I just think letting it continue is unwise, she said firmly. Anyway, consider it on your radar. I'll keep an eye on it, and if the wear becomes visible or if others join in, we'll have a bigger issue. William sighed, making a note in the meeting minutes. All right. Keep us updated. With no further discussion, the board moved on. Deborah, though disappointed that she didn't secure an immediate clampdown on the path, resolved to handle it herself if needed. If the board won't shut it down right away, she thought, I'll do what must be done. Even as she assured herself she was protecting the community, Deborah was unwittingly heading toward a cruel act. Her desire for control, combined with the board's neutrality, granted her leeway to escalate the situation, something that would have far-reaching consequences for Margaret Rowley and Parkside Oasis as a whole. Meanwhile, Margaret Rowley remained largely unaware of the storm brewing. While she sensed Deborah Farnell's disapproval, she trusted that her mild daily stroll could hardly be a serious infraction. She visited her neighbor, Susan Chin, in Building 5's first-floor unit to chat about crocheting patterns and share the day's news. Susan was a sharp-witted retiree in her 70s, quick to spot the tension in Margaret's voice as she recounted Deborah's remarks. She basically insinuated, I shouldn't be walking back there, Margaret said, stirring sugar into her tea. I can't imagine it's a big problem. Nobody else has complained. Susan snorted. That Farnell woman complains about everything. Last month she told me I couldn't keep a small windshield near my front door because it created noise pollution. The rest of the board shrugged it off. She's just extremely fussy. Margaret chuckled softly, though an undercurrent of anxiety lingered. I'm not looking for trouble, but my doctor said daily movement is crucial for my arthritis. The path behind the cypress trees is stable enough for my walker wheels. The sidewalk out front has those bumps near the curb, and the traffic can get noisy. Susan patted Margaret's hand reassuringly. Don't let her stop you. Legally, the courtyard is common property. The HOA can't forbid you from walking on grass unless you're destroying it. Margaret sipped her tea, nodding. She appreciated Susan's support. Being in her 80s, Margaret knew her body wasn't as resilient. Each year felt more precious, and she intended to stay active as long as possible. If she allowed intimidation by an overzealous board member, she risked losing a vital piece of her daily routine. That's what I'll do then, Margaret decided. I'll keep walking. If they truly have an issue, they can come talk to me politely. She tried to sound confident, though an unease simmered within. Part of her expected an eventual confrontation. But surely they won't go to extremes, she thought. It's just a harmless path. Little did Margaret realize that her assumption about no extremes would be tragically proven wrong in the days ahead, as Deborah Farnell orchestrated a plan to eliminate the path by any means necessary. Though the next week passed uneventfully for Margaret, Deborah Farnell seethed as she watched the so-called footpath behind Buildings 4 and 5 remain in use. Not only did Margaret continue her daily loop, but sometimes neighbors strolled with her, offering a friendly good morning. This casual acceptance of the path grated on Deborah's nerves. She felt it was a sign of disorder creeping into Parkside Oasis. One morning, she carefully inspected the grass, crouching down to examine any sign of wear or soil compaction. Sure enough, a faint trail was becoming more evident where walkers had flattened the blades. This is exactly how a lawn gets ruined, Deborah muttered. She snapped photos on her phone, planning to email them to William Groves as evidence. She expected that once he saw the pictures, he'd change his tune. But she worried it might not be enough to spur immediate action. If the board won't step in, Deborah thought grimly, I might have to solve the problem myself. She recalled that the landscaping crew occasionally spread gravel or mulch in certain areas to discourage weeds. Perhaps a strategic use of coarse gravel on the so-called path would make it uncomfortable or impassable, thus steering Margaret elsewhere. At first, Deborah tried to rationalize that scattering gravel was a harmless deterrent, just a means of protecting the grass. But she knew, deep down, her real intent was to block Margaret. Perhaps in her mind, it was for the greater good, ensuring the yard remained pristine for all. The more Deborah dwelled on the plan, the more she convinced herself it was necessary. The notion of sprinkling gravel to sabotage the path became her private mission. She told no one, aware it violated the HOA's own rules about altering common property without approval. Yet she believed she, as an authority figure, had the moral right to enforce compliance. Desperate times, desperate measures, she reasoned. In truth, Deborah's decision was driven by something deeper, perhaps personal frustration, a thirst for control. or a bitterness that her repeated warnings had been ignored. Whatever her motivation, she was about to cross a line between enforcement and reckless endangerment. The final outcome would confirm how a seemingly trivial conflict can turn downright dangerous under the wrong impulses. The incident happened on a warm Tuesday evening, just after dusk. The sky glowed with the remnants of sunset, and most residents were indoors finishing dinner or winding down. In the courtyard, the cypress silhouette stood tall, rustling in a gentle breeze. Wearing dark leggings and a hooded windbreaker, Deborah Farnell approached the community's maintenance shed. She had a key to this storage area. She was on the committee that oversaw landscaping. Inside the shed, she found a half-full bag of coarse gravel used for edging flower beds. Heart-pounding, she lifted it carefully, feeling the grit shift. This should do it, she told herself, pulse thrumming with a mix of excitement and guilt. She carried the bag to the courtyard's rear lawn, scanning for onlookers. None were in sight. Streetlights cast a faint glow, but the cypress trees provided enough shadow for her to move discreetly. Step by step, she poured lines of gravel across the worn path, focusing on where a walker's wheels or footsteps would land. She wanted it to be just enough to impede movement, hopefully enough to discourage Margaret and anyone else from continuing their daily loop. Her mouth felt dry with tension. A small voice in her mind whispered that this was wrong. What if Margaret stumbles? But Deborah pushed the thought aside. She rationalized that she wasn't building a wall, merely creating a rough surface that might nudge Margaret back to the sidewalks. I'm doing the HOA a favor, she muttered under her breath. They'll thank me when the grass recovers. Finishing her task, she lugged the nearly empty bag back to the shed. With trembling hands, she locked it up and hurried home, heart hammering. She repeated to herself that no one would suspect her. And even if they did, she'd frame it as standard landscaping. End of problem, she thought, though a coil of unease remained in her gut. Had she paused to consider the repercussions, Deborah might have stopped right then. But in her obsession with controlling the so-called public track, she took a step that bordered on sabotage. The next morning, Margaret Rowley, along with everyone else, would see the ground strewn with gravel. And what followed would be far from the minor deterrent Deborah anticipated. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight glinting off the dew-laden grass. Margaret Rowley woke with mild stiffness in her joints, nothing unusual for her age. By 7 a.m., she was dressed, wearing sneakers and carrying her walker down the hall. As she stepped outside, she inhaled the fresh air, resolved to keep up her doctor's recommendation. Rounding the building to the courtyard, she immediately noticed something was different. The once smooth strip of grass was now covered with lumps of gray gravel. Brow furrowing, she approached cautiously. Her walker's front wheels bumped and snagged. What on earth, she muttered. Still, Margaret reasoned that she could navigate if she just went slowly. Perhaps the HOA was laying a new surface. I can manage, she thought, adjusting her grip on the walker. Step by careful step, she moved onto the gravel-strewn area. But the stones were large, uneven, and loose. The walker's wheels skidded sideways, catching in a shallow divot. Margaret tried to correct course, but her right foot twisted on a chunk of gravel. In a split second, she lost her balance, and her body lurched forward. She landed hard on her knees, the walker clattering away. Pain lanced up her legs. A startled cry escaped her lips. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't catch her breath. Her first thought was, please, don't let me break a hip. As she tried to recover, the raw sting of bruised knees made her tremble. Her walker lay a few feet off, one wheel bent awkwardly. Tears blurred her vision. She was alone in the courtyard, unsure if she could stand. A wave of panic surged. I can't believe this is happening. Suddenly, a distant voice called, Ma'am, are you okay? Darren Ford, a middle-aged resident walking his dog along the nearby sidewalk, had spotted the tumble. He rushed over, dog leash in hand, kneeling beside Margaret. Oh my goodness, Darren said. Let me help you up. Are you hurt badly? Margaret's voice shook. My knees. I think I might just be bruised, but it hurts terribly to move. Gently, Darren supported her under the arms, guiding her back onto her feet. She winced, gasping at the throbbing pain. Her jeans were torn at the knees, revealing scraped skin. With Darren's help, she hobbled over to a low bench. Why is there gravel all over this spot? Darren asked, scanning the area. This wasn't here last time I walked the dog. Margaret grimaced, tears still in her eyes. I don't know. I've never seen it before. It must have been laid sometime last night. The shock and pain mingled with confusion. Who would do this and why? Darren fished out his phone. Let me call the HOA office. We need to report this. They should send someone to clear it up and get you some help. Margaret nodded, her mind spinning. She felt her heart pounding, a potent mix of fear and anger welling within. This was more than a mild obstacle. It felt like a deliberate trap. Over the next hour, neighbors would gather, and the story of Margaret's fall would spread. Before day's end, Parkside Oasis would be buzzing with outrage, uncertain yet who was responsible for creating such a treacherous condition. Word of Margaret Rowley's fall traveled fast through Parkside Oasis. By mid-morning, neighbors had converged on the courtyard to examine the gravel-laden spot. Some expressed immediate concern for Margaret. Others were furious at the potential sabotage. The scene struck many as not just an unfortunate hazard, but a targeted act of malice. Meanwhile, Margaret rested in her condo, knees wrapped in bandages after a neighbor helped clean the scrapes. Though shaken, she refused a hospital visit, insisting she only needed to ice the bruises. Her walker, however, was damaged. One wheel was bent beyond repair. She'd need a replacement before she could walk safely again. Susan Chin, Margaret's close friend, took it upon herself to phone the HOA office. "This is unacceptable," Susan told the receptionist, voice trembling with anger. An elderly resident was hurt. Someone intentionally scattered gravel. "I demand action. We pay monthly fees for a safe environment, not sabotage." The receptionist, sounding flustered, promised to escalate the complaint to the board. By noon, William Groves, the HOA president, arrived on-site with a maintenance worker. They found the area littered with coarse stones. William's expression darkened as the worker kicked at the gravel. "This is not leftover from normal landscaping," he muttered. "Someone must have dumped it deliberately." William quickly convened an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. Among the board members in attendance were Angela Reed and Terry O'Connell. But notably, Deborah Farnell was absent, claiming she had urgent errands. The small group listened to witness statements, including Darren Ford's account of Margaret's fall. When told how the path had been passable for months before the sudden gravel spread, the board members exchanged troubled looks. "We must figure out who did this," William said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This goes beyond a typical bylaw violation. It's borderline vandalism, potentially assault, given the consequences." Angela Reed agreed. "We'll need to interview the landscaping crew. They might know who took the gravel supply. We can also check if anyone saw suspicious activity last night." Terry jotted notes. "And we should cover Margaret's medical costs if her injuries worsen. Our insurance might handle it, but the HOA can at least pay to replace her walker. It's the least we can do." All the while, questions loomed. Who would stoop so low? And why target an elderly woman's walking route? Some suspected rebellious teenagers from outside the community. Others, more perceptive, recalled Deborah Farnell's vocal opposition to the footpath. Yet no one dared to accuse her without proof. For now, the board resolved to gather information, remove the gravel, and ensure Margaret received help. They recognized that failing to address the incident swiftly could fracture the trust of Parkside Oasis residents. As the day ended, neighbors formed a rotating volunteer crew to rake up and bag the gravel, smoothing the ground as best they could. The courtyard once again resembled a calm, grass-lined space, though an undercurrent of tension remained. An unspoken consensus formed that this was no random accident. The question was whether they'd discover the truth in time to prevent further harm. While the HOA board took steps to investigate, many neighbors noticed that Deborah Farnell kept a low profile that day. Usually, she'd be front and center at any sign of controversy, brandishing her rulebook. Yet she was conspicuously missing from the impromptu courtyard gathering where the gravel was cleared. She also missed the emergency board meeting, an unprecedented absence. Margaret, resting in her unit, received visits from sympathetic neighbors offering well wishes. Darren Ford replaced her broken walker with a spare he had borrowed from a friend. Susan Chin prepared soup and stayed to chat. As people streamed in and out, they quietly shared theories. Could it have been kids messing around? Is there a disgruntled neighbor who hates that path? I recall Ms. Farnell complaining about the foot traffic. Could she be behind this? Margaret grew uneasy hearing Deborah's name. She recalled their brief exchange days ago. Deborah had seemed irritated but not openly hostile. Still, the possibility weighed heavily on Margaret's mind. Could Deborah truly do something so cruel? She had no proof, only a gnawing feeling that the timing was too coincidental. That evening, the HOA placed a robocall to all residents, reminding them to report suspicious activity and confirming that a damaging incident had occurred. They also appealed for any witnesses to come forward. The message concluded with an assurance that the board was dedicated to ensuring the safety of all residents, effectively acknowledging that sabotage had taken place. Deborah, listening to the message in her home, felt her chest tighten. She recognized the seriousness of what she'd done. She tried to quell her guilt by insisting she hadn't meant for Margaret to fall, only to discourage her from using that path. But the moral lines were blurred. What if the old woman sues the HOA? Deborah worried. She dreaded an interrogation about the missing gravel, which she alone had signed out as landscaping supply on an internal log. If discovered, she might face not just condemnation, but legal consequences. Torn between shame and defiance, Deborah resolved to keep her head down. If I stay silent, maybe they'll blame some random vandal, she told herself. Yet she knew her conspicuous absence might raise suspicions. She would soon discover that the longer she avoided accountability, the more the community rallied to protect Margaret and to ensure the footpath thrived in a new, improved form. 2 days later, Margaret's bruised knees had improved, though she still walked gingerly. The HOA had arranged a landscaping crew to remove any remaining gravel and smooth the dirt. However, a few residents realized that simply removing gravel wouldn't address the underlying desire for a safe, accessible footpath. During a casual conversation in the courtyard, Darren Ford, Susan Chin, and a younger neighbor named Rebecca Owens shared an idea. Why not turn Margaret's informal route into a proper walking loop for all ages? Rebecca, a fitness enthusiast, explained her perspective. We have sidewalks, sure, but traffic can get loud, and the sidewalk in front is uneven from tree roots. The courtyard loop is more peaceful, with fewer tripping hazards, if properly maintained. I'd love to have a designated loop to jog, and older folks can walk safely. Susan chimed in. Plus, if it's official, we can set up small benches along the way. Margaret or anyone else who needs to rest can sit down. Darren nodded. Maybe even add a sign calling it the morning mile or something encouraging. That way, it's not just an afterthought. People can incorporate it into a daily routine, building a sense of community. They decided to bring the idea to the HOA board, hoping it would gather enough support to overshadow Deborah Farnell's push against unapproved foot traffic. If the HOA officially recognized and paved the loop, no one could sabotage it with gravel again. Fired up by the conversation, Rebecca drafted a brief proposal, a simple plan to add a thin layer of seal coating or packed mulch to define the loop, plus a few motivational signs like "keep going" or "you can do it." She suggested painting small footprints or arrows along the route, ensuring it was easy to follow. The estimated cost wasn't huge. It could be covered by the Community Improvement Fund. That afternoon, the three neighbors emailed the proposal to the HOA board. They titled it The Morning Mile, a safe, inclusive walking path for Parkside Oasis. They explained that Margaret's incident exposed the need for better infrastructure. By offering an official route, they argued, the HOA promoted wellness and prevented random off-plan paths that might cause conflicts. When William Groves received the email, he felt a glimmer of hope that something constructive might emerge from this troubling episode. He forwarded it to the other board members, including Deborah. Although Deborah's immediate reaction was unknown, the rest of the board warmed to the concept. It was a positive solution, turning a messy situation into an asset for the neighborhood. No one could predict how fiercely Deborah Farnell would oppose the plan. Regardless, a wave of neighborly goodwill was gathering momentum, ready to transform the once-disputed footpath into a shared amenity. All that remained was for the board to vote. The next HOA board meeting took place on a sunny Saturday morning in the community clubhouse. Word had spread about the Morning Mile proposal, so attendance was higher than usual, around 30 residents, many curious about the plan. Margaret arrived, supported by her friend Susan. She still felt stiff, but her spirit was determined. Darren, Rebecca, and others who had championed the idea also took seats, eager to present their vision. At the front table sat the 5 board members: President William Groves, Secretary Maria Hensley, Treasurer Terry O'Connell, Member-at-Large Angela Reed, and Compliance Officer Deborah Farnell. Deborah's expression was guarded, eyes flicking across the room. She gripped a printed copy of the Morning Mile proposal. After addressing a few routine agenda items, William Groves introduced the next point: We have a community-driven proposal to formalize a walking path in the courtyard behind buildings 4 and 5, nicknamed the Morning Mile. This comes in response to the recent incident involving Margaret Rowley's fall. He paused, glancing sympathetically at Margaret. The idea is to make a safe, accessible route for all residents. Rebecca Owens stood to speak, explaining the concept. She described the minimal cost, the seal coating or smooth surface, plus small motivational signs. We believe this fosters unity, promotes health, and avoids unregulated paths that might lead to confusion or sabotage, she concluded, choosing her words carefully. Several neighbors applauded softly. Margaret, smiling, offered a quiet thank you from her seat. She hoped this plan would mean no one else would face a hidden hazard like she had. Deborah Farnell cleared her throat, signaling her turn. Her voice was clipped and measured. While I appreciate the enthusiasm, we must acknowledge potential pitfalls. Altering the courtyard fundamentally changes our landscaping layout. We risk losing green space to a paved track. Costs could spiral, repairs, signage, ongoing maintenance. And we set a precedent that every resident's personal desire must be accommodated. A subtle tension filled the room. Some neighbors frowned, others shook their heads. Deborah continued. Furthermore, there's no conclusive proof that the courtyard is safer than our existing sidewalks. If we give it an official stamp of approval, we assume liability should anyone get injured there. Rebecca attempted a calm rebuttal. Respectfully, Miss Farnell, we're aware of liability. That's why we propose a well-maintained surface. And many residents find the courtyard quieter and more accessible than the main roads. It's about offering a choice. Maria Hensley, the secretary, jumped in gently. Cost-wise, we've seen the rough estimates. They're within reason, especially given the improvement fund we have. If we do it right, the track would be an asset. Our property values might even rise with an added amenity. At that, Deborah's jaw tightened. She disliked hearing that the plan had potential benefits. She feigned concern over the budget, but everyone sensed her deeper motive, preserving the uniformity she so rigidly enforced, and perhaps burying any reference to the sabotage that triggered this idea. William Groves, observing the polarized reactions, decided to hold an official board vote. All in favor of adopting the Morning Mile proposal, please raise your hand, he said. Maria, Terry, and Angela immediately lifted their hands. William hesitated only a moment, then raised his as well. That made 4 votes. All eyes fell on Deborah Farnell, whose expression was stony. No, she said flatly. Yet it didn't matter, majority ruled. The motion passed 4-1. Applause broke out among the residents. Margaret felt tears welling, relieved and touched. As the meeting adjourned, people gathered to congratulate Rebecca and Darren, thanking them for their initiative. Meanwhile, Deborah Farnell briskly packed her documents, stepping away before anyone could approach her. She felt a knot in her stomach. Not only had the path been approved, but the entire community was rallying around the concept that she had tried to destroy. With the board's approval secured, the Morning Mile project moved quickly. By midweek, a local contractor arrived to begin prepping the courtyard. Workers removed leftover gravel from the sabotage, loosened compacted soil, and laid down a level layer of seal coat in a neat loop. Where the loop cut through grass, they edged the path with a low wooden border, preventing future washouts. It was all done carefully, ensuring minimal disruption to the surrounding lawn and landscaping. Curious onlookers peered from balconies or strolled by, impressed by the transformation. Even with partial construction, the route looked promising, wide enough for a walker or stroller, smooth enough to reduce tripping hazards. The contractor planned to place small signs at intervals, featuring uplifting messages like "Keep going, one step at a time," and "You're almost there." Meanwhile, the question of who caused Margaret's accident lingered. A rumor circulated that the maintenance shed's gravel supply had been checked out under Deborah Farnell's name a few nights before Margaret's fall. A few residents claimed to have seen Deborah near the courtyard at odd hours, but no one publicly confronted her yet. The HOA board quietly investigated, but lacking a smoking gun or direct confession, they hesitated to accuse an active board member. Deborah, for her part, maintained a tense silence. She noticed the subtle sideways glances neighbors threw her way. During her daily walks, now more cautious and less frequent, she overheard whispers. "It's gotta be her. I hear she hates that path." Can't believe she'd stooped that low. The swirl of suspicion isolated her further from the community. Each new sign or improvement to the Morning Mile felt like an indictment of her sabotage. Simultaneously, as the new path neared completion, Margaret Rowley found renewed hope. Her knees had healed enough that she could walk carefully with her replacement walker. The knowledge that so many neighbors cared enough to create this official loop buoyed her spirits. She daydreamed of strolling it again without fear, perhaps in the early mornings, hearing birdsong under the cypress trees. In a quiet moment, Margaret wondered if Deborah might apologize or show remorse. Surely she didn't intend such harm, Margaret mused. But day after day passed with no outreach from Deborah. That silence spoke volumes. Soon enough, the unveiling of the morning mile would arrive, and with it, a public celebration that would leave Deborah Farnell on the outside looking in. 2 weekends later, the morning mile was ready. The HOA organized a small ribbon-cutting ceremony, announcing it in newsletters and online forums. They invited all residents to gather by the courtyard on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. for refreshments, a short speech, and the official first walk around the newly minted path. Sunshine bathed the courtyard that day. Balloons bobbed near a modest refreshments table offering fruit, coffee, and water. By 9 a.m., a decent crowd of neighbors had assembled, families with strollers, older couples, a handful of joggers in workout clothes. Margaret Rowley arrived with Susan Chin, beaming when she saw the smooth path winding gracefully beneath the cypress trees. At a small lectern set up near the starting point, William Groves addressed the crowd. "Welcome, everyone, to the unveiling of our new walking loop. We call it the Morning Mile, though it's actually just under half a mile. We hope you'll enjoy multiple laps if you're up for it." Laughter rippled through the group. He nodded toward Margaret. "Some of you know that an unfortunate incident motivated this improvement. I want to publicly commend Ms. Margaret Rowley for her resilience. She could have let a setback keep her indoors, but instead, her example inspired the community to create something better." Modest applause rose, and Margaret flushed. She mouthed a silent thank you from across the courtyard. Next, Rebecca Owens said a few words on behalf of the neighbors who led the proposal. "We're proud of how Parkside Oasis came together to support a safe, welcoming space for all ages and abilities. May it serve as a reminder that a little kindness can turn any patch of grass into a place of belonging." More applause followed. Then, in a symbolic gesture, Margaret was invited to cut a small ribbon stretched across the path's entrance. Hands trembling with emotion, she snipped the ribbon. The crowd cheered. As the group prepared for a celebratory first walk, some scanned the periphery for Deborah Farnell. She stood at a distance, arms crossed, wearing a pinched expression. While she felt compelled to attend in her official capacity, she hovered where she wouldn't be asked to speak or show support. When the procession began, with Margaret at the front, Deborah quietly turned on her heel and left. Each step the crowd took on that pristine, sealed path felt like a repudiation of her sabotage. The loop belonged to the community now, a testament to unity over pettiness. In that moment, Deborah recognized that no matter how she justified her actions, she'd been beaten by the unstoppable force of neighborly cooperation. Although the Morning Mile was now a beloved fixture, the HOA board still had lingering questions about the gravel incident. William Groves, noticing the strong circumstantial evidence pointing to Deborah Farnell, decided it was time to confront her privately. He couldn't ignore the moral implications. If a sitting board member had indeed caused harm, trust in the HOA would erode. One late afternoon, William invited Deborah to meet him in the community office. She arrived cautiously, bracing for a difficult conversation. Sitting across a small desk, the two faced each other with subdued tension. "Deborah," William began gently, "we've been investigating the sabotage of the courtyard path. The landscaping log shows that you checked out a bag of gravel on the evening before Margaret's fall. Also, we have testimonies from neighbors seeing you near that area late. Can you explain?" Deborah's breath caught. She'd rehearsed excuses, but none sounded convincing. I was planning to fill a small drainage area by my building," she finally stammered. "Maybe I left some gravel out there temporarily." William sighed, leaning forward. "Look, Deborah, we both know Margaret's accident was no fluke. This was targeted. You've been vocal about your disapproval of that path. I'm asking you directly. Did you scatter gravel on the route?" She avoided his gaze. "I never intended to hurt anyone. All I did was try to preserve the lawn. The footpath was unauthorized. I thought some rough ground might deter usage." A sad silence settled. William tapped his pen on the desk. "Do you realize how dangerous that was? Margaret fell, bruised her knees, damaged her walker. She could have suffered a far worse injury. The entire neighborhood was outraged. Deborah swallowed, cheeks burning. I regret the outcome, truly. But the board refused to address the problem. So I took matters into my own hands. William shook his head, anger and disappointment mingling. We have rules for a reason, Deborah. You've always insisted on them. Yet you violated them yourself when it suited you. Intentionally creating a hazard in a common area is indefensible. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued. Given these findings and your admission, we have grounds to request your resignation from the board. If you won't resign, we'll likely move for a formal vote of removal. Deborah felt a wave of indignation and a pang of shame. She'd dedicated years to the HOA, seeing herself as its guardian. Now she faced the possibility of being ousted, her reputation in tatters. What if I refuse? She asked quietly. William's expression hardened. Then we'll proceed with an official motion. I doubt you have the support to survive it. This has gone too far, Deborah. Tears pricked her eyes, though she tried to maintain composure. The cost of her sabotage had become undeniable. I'll consider the best course, she muttered. But, for the record, I didn't want anyone hurt. I only wanted to maintain the standards of Parkside Oasis. With that, she stood and left, shoulders rigid. William exhaled heavily. He took no pleasure in the confrontation but felt it necessary. Deborah Farnell's era of near-tyrannical oversight was ending, undone by her own extreme actions. In the days that followed, Deborah Farnell quietly tendered her resignation from the HOA board, citing personal reasons. An official announcement was made in the community newsletter. We extend our gratitude to Ms. Farnell for her past service and wish her well. There was no mention of the sabotage or the behind-the-scenes tension, but residents who followed the events knew the real story. Meanwhile, the morning mile thrived. Each morning, early risers gathered to walk or jog the loop. Small motivational signs dotted the path, bringing smiles to passers-by. Margaret Rowley grew stronger with every circuit, regaining confidence lost after her fall. Younger neighbors occasionally offered to join her, turning a solitary walk into a communal stroll. On weekends, families pushed strollers along the loop, while seniors ambled in pairs, chatting about gardening or local events. The courtyard became a hub of friendly encounters, bridging generational gaps. The success even inspired talk of adding a mini flower garden or a water fountain next to the path. As for Deborah Farnell, she became something of a recluse in her condo, rarely seen outside. A few sympathetic souls tried to greet her politely, but she mostly avoided eye contact. The stigma of having endangered an elderly neighbor cast a long shadow. Some whispered she might sell her unit and move elsewhere. Regardless, her once dominant presence in Parkside Oasis had faded, overshadowed by the path's positive legacy. Months later, Margaret Rowley completed a full circuit on the morning mile with minimal stops. She paused at the finish line, marked by a cheerful sign reading, "You did it," and felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. She reflected on how a malicious act of scattering gravel had, ironically, sparked a wave of community spirit. The transformation of that dusty patch of lawn into a safe, scenic route stood as proof that neighborly kindness could triumph over fear and hostility. Parkside Oasis entered a new chapter of unity after the Morning Mile project. Eager to capitalize on the positive energy, the HOA board introduced small monthly gatherings along the path, like group walks for charity or evening socials with lemonade stands. Residents who once merely passed each other in the hallway now struck up friendships. Grandparents strolled with grandchildren, couples jogged side by side, and even the occasional dog trotted alongside a proud owner. Margaret Rowley became a modest celebrity of sorts, the friendly face behind the path's origin story. She never boasted or pointed fingers at her saboteur. Instead, she welcomed the support and quietly championed the idea that neighbors should help one another thrive. Deborah Farnell remained in the community for a short while, but her influence vanished. She was no longer an HOA board member, no longer a constant presence scanning for infractions. Rumor had it she felt remorse, or perhaps bitterness, over how events unfolded. But ultimately, she drifted away, seldom seen or heard. For Parkside Oasis, the final lesson was that a single malicious act, spreading gravel on a senior's walkway, could be transformed into a catalyst for a permanent improvement. The loop became a symbol of resilience, reminding everyone that confrontation need not end in permanent division. With compassion and collaboration, even the darkest chapters can yield something bright. And so, each new dawn found Margaret and many other residents taking steps along the morning mile, celebrating the sense of belonging they found in shared movement. Long after Deborah's meddling was forgotten, the path endured, a testament to how kindness and community spirit can outshine the most disruptive attempts at control.